So, what happens when we pass? Where do we go when we die? And isn't it kind of funny that we use a spatial terminology to try to talk about this? Going, we have this phrase, he's in a better place now. As if he left Augusta and went to southern France or something. It's kind of odd when you think about it. It's said that at this time of year, the veil is very thin. The veil between this world and the next. But maybe we shouldn't talk about two different worlds. Maybe really there's just so much more to this world than we realize with our veiled senses. Jesus calls Lazarus from the tomb. And that's a miracle that many dismiss out of hand. It's just a good metaphor maybe, but too much to believe, too much to process. But for Jesus, from his perspective, maybe it's not a miracle at all. Maybe what he's doing is just reaching into the veil and drawing into appearance what has already always been there. This living man, Lazarus. Say the veil is very thin this time of year. And you can feel it sometimes, especially at what's called the gloaming. I think I've spoken of this before. It's that time of day when, after the sun is set and the last light is being sucked out of the day. And for some reason, this time of year, just for maybe a month or so, and not the rest of the year, if you sit in that gloaming, just take some time, turn the lights off, light a candle maybe, you'll find that prayer flows very freely. And the response to prayer feels more immediate. Gloaming, and the veil is thin. 24 years and 7 months and a couple weeks ago, approximately, my infant daughter Leah died. And for quite a moment, the veil was torn open. And God felt very near. Not in a threatening way at all, but not in an entirely comfortable way either. It was very shortly after that, through one of those many little acts of God that sort of bump us along, that I discovered Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Perhaps you've heard of her. She was a Swiss physician, a doctor. And being both Swiss and a doctor, well, first of all, she loved chocolate. That was the Swiss part. But she also had that Germanic, scientific mind that was not given to magical thinking. And she was working with children mostly in the hospital, and she started to hear stories from people who had died for several minutes and then been resuscitated and remembered what they experienced. This is really interesting. So she started to collect more stories. Hundreds, thousands of stories. Children and, of course, adults. And she saw a lot of common things in the stories. Tried to follow them up. So, for example, it was very common for people to say that they were met by someone that they knew. Parents, grandparents, friends. And she thought, well, okay, if there's some mental activity, and this is a traumatic experience maybe, it's only natural to think that the mind would, imagine or project a comforting presence. Except she couldn't find a single case where anyone was met by someone who had not already died. And you'd think, especially for children, if Mommy and Daddy were still alive, they weren't there to greet. If Grandma and Grandpa were still alive, they weren't there. So that's very interesting. And then there were stories from people who had been crippled or disabled in some way. And they said that they could see their body, they were out of it, and yet at the same time they felt like they had a body and a whole body, and they could move their limbs, they could even dance. And again, she thought, well, maybe that's not too surprising to project that. And then there were stories from people who were blind, who said they could see. And then would describe in detail the room and what was in the room and the pattern on the doctor's tie. Maybe you've heard stories like this before. Maybe you've experienced some things like this. I met a priest in Massachusetts who died and been resuscitated, and he said that he found himself in a room where his father and some other people were playing pool. They were around a pool table shooting pool. And his father looked at him really surprised and said, "You're not supposed to be here yet." The next thing he remembered was waking up in the recovery room. I have a Jewish friend who was sitting with a friend of hers who had a terminal illness. And from the time that her friend had received this diagnosis, she was not happy about it. Big surprise, right? But I mean, she was anxious and angry. And it was finally getting near the end. And all of a sudden she said, "Oh, if I knew it was going to be this beautiful, I wouldn't have complained." It's the last we heard from her on this side of the veil. My mother-in-law was sitting with her father, who was dying of cancer. And for a long time he had been totally unresponsive. It's just a matter of waiting for the end. He suddenly sat up in bed and said, "Look at that beautiful light." And he turned to his daughter and said, "Peggy, do you see it? That beautiful light." Last we heard of him on this side of the veil. Some experience of light is very common among these stories. Seeing a light and going into a light, and even experiencing the light as a being, as a person. I met this woman who, again, had died and lived to tell about it. And she went into a light that, well, when we say where sorrow and pain are no more, apparently that doesn't come close to describing. Just undescribable bliss and peace in this light. Couldn't imagine anything better. And then she was told, "You have to go back." And she said, "No, please, please," she pleaded. She thought, being Christian, that the light for her was Jesus. She said, "Jesus, no, don't send me back, don't do that." So he took a red thread, put it in the palm of her hand, and said, "Hold on to this." And somehow that made the transition easier from that. She was an interesting woman. Didn't tell that story to many people because not many people want to hear it for some reason. But on the one hand, she was living life here with absolutely no fear of death. And yet at the same time, she really never really felt at home in this world anymore. It's kind of an awkward place to be. I remember hearing about a story, maybe it was a play, and I'm sorry I don't remember where I heard about it or who wrote it or what it was called. But it was about Lazarus. After he's taken out of the tomb, Lazarus and Jesus and all the family and friends are having a big feast. I suppose he was pretty hungry. And they're all having this party, and throughout the evening, Lazarus and Jesus keep catching each other's eye and laughing. Like they have some joke that only they can share. What happens when we pass? Where do we go? I don't know, really, do I? And you probably don't either. Maybe the real question is when the time comes, and it does come. Are we going to be ready to receive it? Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb and says what might be one of the most beautiful things Jesus ever says. Unbind him. Let him go. Amen.